ado, tonight for your entertainment, Dr. Hugo Anderson Whymark, curator of early prehistory at National Museum of Scotland, Edinburgh, will be talking to us about global access to cultural heritage and the 3D modelling of monuments and artefacts. Hugo's an active field archaeologist. He's currently co-directing excavations at Tresness in Sanday, Orkney, and Hugo is a specialist in prehistoric stone tools, about which we had a really interesting talk yesterday, as it happens. And Hugo's research interests span the Upper Paleolithic to Bronze Age, but focus on the Neolithic. So, Hugo, I'm going to hand things over to yourself. Thank you very much.
That's great. Right, just give me a second, and I'll share my screen and get my talk up. Right. Can everyone see that?
Yep.
Okay, and I'll just minimize that. Right, okay. So I think that's ready to go then. So yeah, thank you for inviting me to talk today. This is actually the first presentation I've done remotely, so it feels like a very unusual experience, and I can 100% get what Kenny was saying about now I'm talking just to my own presentation. So quite a strange experience. But yeah, I want to talk to you today about sort of 3D modelling of archaeological sites and artefacts. And I'm going to keep this quite a general talk. I had hoped to bring in a lot more examples from sort of Highland region, but I haven't really been able to travel that far this year. So I've not been able to produce many more models this year than I had last year. And obviously access to our collections at the museum are somewhat limited at the moment too. But I've pulled together a selection of things that I've produced over the years, and hopefully we can have a bit of an overview of those. So it will be a selection of things from Highland and some further afield, like Queen Tomb, which obviously you can see here. So I'm talking tonight mostly about sort of 3D modelling of archaeological sites and artefacts, but obviously this form of digitization is just one of many that are being tackled at the moment, and it's really never been a more important time to try and digitize some of our collections and some of our sites to actually make that remote access to places that we can't necessarily get to easily at this current time. And in fact, for some of the sites like these tombs, creating digital models has always provided an alternative way of access, which obviously is a key issue when you've certainly got very limited access to some of these monuments, and some being very remote as well. Now at the museum, we have a sort of range of digitization programs sort of always ongoing. The 3D modelling is just a very small part of what we do at the moment. Probably only produce about 100 3D models a year, but we try and tackle many different aspects of our sort of collections, from documents. Here a record of carved stone balls from the early 20th century. As you might appreciate, an institution going back to the 1780s has a lot of old paperwork, much of which contains some very interesting information. It's just a rather big sort of quantity of material to try and digitize and make accessible.
Sorry, Hugo, could I very quickly interrupt? Could I just ask you to put your presentation on? Actually, start the presentation. It's currently on the sort of the PowerPoint.
Oh, I was
application.
Watching it. Oh, hang on. Did I start it on the wrong screen? Possibly. Yeah, I think because I was watching my presentation. Sorry. Right, I'll try and share a different screen. So if I share just my desktop, will that be the solution to this? Right, is that
perfect?
Different?
That's okay, better.
Yeah, sorry,
much better. Brilliant.
I've shared the wrong screen. Right, so you've not missed much really. It was just this one slide I'm on. So what I was saying is that obviously we have a very broad range of materials in the museum. We're working at trying to digitize different aspects of the collections. If you've been onto our Search the Collections recently, you'll notice a few developments happening here in terms of the prehistory collections. Over the past 2 years since I've been working at the museum, we've made quite a few changes to some of the object names and some of the descriptions in this category. So, for example, I've put up here an image of a page of carved stone balls. When I started at the museum, carved stone ball wasn't actually an object name sort of search term, which obviously made it very difficult to find these objects on our database. Now you can find them all within a single search, and we've been adding additional information on the context and the details to provide a bit more background about these objects. One of the things we're really focusing on as well is trying to get more images of our artifacts online. You'll see the carved stone balls here. We have mainly images against them, and most of the carved stone balls do have images now, except many of those which are actually away on loan at different museums. But you know, we get about 5,000 new images online every year at the museum. But when you consider the scale of our collections, there's, you know, a massive amount which still don't have images, and it's a long process trying to get more of our collections online. But it does provide a very good way of accessing the collections, certainly through my own research. I really value having images of artifacts online, and 3D models provide a different way of engaging with our collections, and one I really want to talk about today. Oh, what's happened there? Why am I going to talk about 3D modeling today? And my personal, it's one of my sort of really real interests in archaeology, because it's a field that's changed.
Oh, Hugo,
so much.
Sorry, Hugo. I think things have gone a bit awry again.
Oh,
Possibly
right.
you're on possibly the wrong screen. I think you may have just come out and then gone back into the wrong screen, possibly.
One popped up, and yes, okay, let's have a little look. Right. Which one? We're on. Oh, hang on. I see. It's okay. So if I go back to, yes, the team screen popped up and stole the show. Right. So I think, right, let's. Okay, are we back?
We're back. Looking
Okay.
good.
Okay, right. Sorry about that. Let's minimize that too. How did I get rid of that last time? There we go. Right, hang on, I've jumped forward a bit there, haven't I? Right, so I'm going to be talking about 3D today because for me it's a very exciting, very rapidly developing field. And there's two sort of things that really interest me here and excite me, is the fact that there's been new techniques developed over the last decade, really, that have really reduced the cost of producing 3D models. Don't need a laser scanner, you don't need specialist equipment anymore. With structure from motion photogrammetry, which is what I'm primarily going to be talking about my models being produced in today, essentially all you need is a camera, a moderately powerful computer, and you can produce models like you can see here. And in fact, you know, it's fallen to such an extent now that it's really a technology that's accessible to all. Anyone can make 3D models with a little bit of insight in how to take the photos. There's free programs such as sort of Meshroom, which you can use to actually produce models. It's something that everyone can now do. It's a very accessible medium to actually work in and create models. I mean, I want to just look back briefly to how things were sort of 23 years ago. And I like this example, because 1997 was the year I graduated from university. So this was the cutting edge technology when I came out my undergraduate degree. And this is stereo photogrammetry of the stones at Stonehenge. And the paper it came out, it was really cutting edge at the time. And they were boasting of these models of 60,000 points and file sizes of up to 6 megabytes. You know, that's a single photograph these days. And the model I previously showed here, that's meshed from about 100 million points, which is just processed on a home computer. So it's, you know, that technology has come forward vastly. But I think the key thing here is the point which was made at the end of this paper, that although they created these wonderful models of Stonehenge in 1997, the people working at Stonehenge, the regional teams, couldn't access them. And this quote at the end really sums it up, that the teams actually had to be rest assured that a detailed model of these important stones now existed. No one could actually use it or see it. So it's a bit, it was there, but you couldn't access it. And that's the other thing that's really changed in the last few years, is since the implementation of sort of WebGL on websites, you can now embed 3D models in websites, any website across the internet. And the development of sites such as sketchfab.com give an incredible way that you can share any 3D model that you make. And you can view it both on your computer or in virtual reality, in augmented reality, all from the one place. So that's such an incredible advance. And really, this is, there are new developments in this on a weekly basis, but over the last 5 years, it's become so accessible. And really now you can run even those high resolution models on most phones and tablets. So it's made it very accessible. You can visit any one of these sites anywhere in the world, and that to me is quite exciting. Also with Sketchfab, you have the wonderful facilities that they've created of actually being able to modify the environments that you're putting your model into, change the lighting, improve the textures, add the shadows, adjust things, even put a depth of field on the models, which makes it realistic. It makes it feel more like a visitor experience. And to really follow that up, you can annotate the models too, and provide a virtual tour of any site, highlighting what you want to emphasize on that monument, telling the story you want to tell about an object. Say this axe at the bottom corner here, this object, the labels on it were the thing I was interested in, because they told how it went to the Glasgow exhibition in 1911, and actually allowed us to reunite that object with its provenance through tracing all the little bits of information on those labels. So I'm going to talk a bit about carved stone balls this evening, and the reason for this is that this is one of my ongoing projects at National Museum Scotland. I've modelled about half of the carved stone balls that we have in the collections. That's about 100 out of 200 carved stone balls, and that's a sort of significant proportion of the overall total. There are around 330 known carved stone balls, and that's ones we know the location of. I suspect there's probably about 500 plus which actually exist, but we don't know the whereabouts of many of these. For those of you who aren't familiar with carved stone balls, the group that's swirling around here is quite sort of representative. They're all a very similar size. They fit neatly in the palm of your hand. They have a variety of different forms. So from sort of 6 knobs types, like the one just passing at the top now, are the most typical of the group. But you have 3, 4, 10, 100 knobs, up to over 200 knobs on some carved stone balls. And you can see the sort of huge differences in the way they're decorated and dressed. So these objects, they date from around 3000 BC, 5,000 years old effectively, and we know that from the few examples that have actually been found in situ on sites such as Skara Brae and the Ness of Brodgar. Now, the one thing which is very interesting about these, the one thing that's often captured the imagination, is how limited the distribution of these artefacts actually is. So most of them are found in Aberdeenshire and sort of immediately surrounding counties, but there is a distribution that extends up sort of the east coast of Highland into Orkney, and then rapidly drops off towards the Western Isles and down into Perthshire. Beyond that distribution, it's very limited. There's 2 from England, 1, possibly 2 examples from Ireland, and a single find from Norway. And the Norwegian one is a bit of a mystery, actually. It was found in a clearance cairn in the 1940s, but how it got there, we don't really know. At the time, they attributed it to the Vikings, but I mean, we don't know if it got there, you know, before then, or in the distant past, or in the 19th century. It's not detailed at all. So one of the things that really interests people about these objects is what their function was. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about this tonight, because there are too many possibilities, as it were. Lots of functional options like weights and measures. Some very, you know, ever since these were first sort of discovered, there was a suggestion that they were weapons, either sort of mounted on a stick as a mace head, or bound with twine and sort of used as a throwing weapon or a sort of swinging weapon, as like South American bolas. So that sort of works for some, but obviously you can see some here are very highly decorated. And so we also see interpretations of these as more being symbols of power and authority, which, you know, obviously we see very clear sort of elite sort of activity in the late Neolithic. So it could be associated with that. And more recently, Lynn Kelly has suggested that these were perhaps objects associated with memory, that they were objects that held the oral, you know, were used to recall the oral history of a society, which is obviously something very important in a society that didn't have its own written records. Now, here's a couple of examples from Highland region, and you know, the 3D modeling I'm using here is to try and bring out some of the details on these objects. This sort of nice example from Castletown here, one of the sort of more unusual sort of four-knobbed examples, which is quite finely finished, whereas this one from Brock of Yarhouse on the other side, it's not from the Brock of Yarhouse, it was found in a field near the Brock of Yarhouse, but that was enough to, in the 19th century, to suggest that some of these were Iron Age in date, but it's not actually got a close association with that site at all. But you can see this object is a far cruder form, in that you can see the ball has been ground to shape. It's got the sort of smooth bosses on the surface, but the actual area around is quite roughly pecked, relatively crudely worked. There is obviously some modern damage on here as well. But you know, you can get the essence that this is never going to have been a particularly regular form. It's got 8 large knobs located around the surface and three sort of smaller knobs. Now, in terms of making these models, I like photogrammetry. It's you know, there are obviously other ways of doing it, but I have a sort of very expedient setup for capturing the images here. The photo in the middle is a very basic setup I used for when I was traveling around a lot of museums, simply having some bright lighting. In terms of this, I was using flashes because they were lighter to carry than heavier lighting rigs. But more recently, I used a light box with an automated turntable, and that just automates that process of capturing images at regular intervals around the object. So on the left-hand side, you can see an image of a carved stone ball, and each one of those blue rectangles is an individual photo that's gone into that model. And so you can see there are about 200 images, 150, 200 images that have gone into that model to get a very high resolution view of that particular carved stone ball. And so this process of image capture is relatively quick. It takes about 20 minutes or so to capture the images for each model. So quite a speedy process, and actually carved stone ball is really the ideal shape to capture these things quickly on photogrammetry. There's no tricky angles or surfaces to hiding away to work with. So on the left here, you have the Towie ball, which is perhaps the best known carved stone ball. And I'm toggling between a textured model, which has the photographic texture, and the sort of a metallic surface, which is actually the form of the surface of that object. And you'll see that the decoration is much clearer when it is this sort of reflective metallic surface. It's something that's been known for a very long time, that if you make surfaces shiny effectively reflected, it helps you see that detail in the object. And this is one of the key things reasons I've been 3D modeling carved stone balls, is so that you can see that level of detail. Because what I'm really interested in is how these are worked, and being able to identify that. And so when I'm sharing these models online, I want other people to appreciate that. So I tend to share my models at a very high resolution. You can reduce it obviously to a 10,000 or fewer polygons, but you lack the detail. You can put a good surface photographic texture on that makes it look good, but actually when you take that away, it's not a very good model. So I prefer to have that detail. It makes it easier to see those patterns on the surface. Now, on the right-hand side, there's another carved stone ball. That's two views of the same carved stone ball from exactly the same position. And this, again, is just to emphasize how the surface texture, that black and white stone, really masks you seeing any detail on the surface of that object. If you look at the metallic version, what you can actually begin to see is that there are some lines encircling this surface. There's 3 lines in total, and if I click, I've drawn them just to make it easier to see. So this object actually is a decorated carved stone ball. It has some incised decoration on the surface of those bosses, but it's invisible. That object has been in the museum since the 1890s, looked at for every study on carved stone balls, and it's not actually, that detail has never been observed before. Now, the other thing you can see on here, if you look on this edge, I hope you can see the mouse moving around here, that you can see that there is a little round area here that seems to have been pecked out of the larger disc on this surface. And there's a second one just appearing on that side there. And these two areas appear to be the reworking of that big disc into smaller knobs. So we're potentially seeing extra phases of working on this carved stone ball than we previously knew were there. Now, Andy Jones recently in a study of art across Britain, prehistoric art across Britain, suggested that with carved stone balls, what we're seeing is a process of these objects evolving from one form to another over time. And certainly, I've put up a few here to just sort of broadly represent that idea of, say, from this first one, these triangular interspaces. It's got very limited working on the surface, to examples where that triangular interspace has been removed. And certainly when we 3D model these, you can sometimes see details in the texture that show that those triangles have been dressed away after the rest of the surface has been finished. And then moving along, potentially these objects being shaped into forms which have larger, more prominent knobs than these ones which have very shallow discs retain much of their circular form. Now that example is just of a sort of carved stone ball which retains its basic idea of having 6 knobs. But in some examples, we're potentially seeing a lot more transformation. So much like that one where we're beginning to see one disc reworked into smaller knobs, there are other examples where we can quite clearly see this going on. This example here, you've got a large disc, and you can just see on this one edge that started to be reworked into small knobs, and across this side here you can see part of that design has already been removed into smaller knobs across that surface. So this object is in the process of changing its shape, and some of the carved stone balls we have, which have numerous knobs across the surface, have little hints, like this line running through this object here, that there was once another design on these surfaces that has been removed and reworked into the current form we see. So perhaps these objects were almost constantly changing. They didn't hold a static form. They were reworked over time and evolved in their form. And perhaps sort of not more so apparent than on this one example on the right-hand side, where we can see 2 views of the same carved stone ball. one which is obviously very much like a six-knobbed carved stone ball, but you turn it over, and where there should be a disc, it's replaced by a sort of rosette of small knobs, and the interspaces and other areas have begun to be worked as well. So this object is changing form. It's very much changing in character from one form to another. So yeah, kind of an interesting thing about how those objects are changing over time. And as I said, these models are all available on Sketchfab at the National Museum. As soon as we produce these models, they go online, so you can see them. You can see them as quickly as I produce them. I have about another 20 I'm processing at the moment that will go up in the coming weeks. And we're getting some incredible sort of viewing figures for some of these objects. The Towie ball has had about 35,000 views since we put it up. Not all are as popular. Many are in hundreds or lower figures than that. But we're getting a lot of interest. But what we're seeing is that some of the models we put out really catch the imagination. You might have heard about the hoard, the Bronze Age hoard of horse harness fittings with a sword laying over the top that was discovered in the borders earlier in the summer. That we went out and excavated, and the 3D model that we put out of that to go out with the press release attracted more than 200,000 views within a few days of it being released. So this is really something that people are very actively engaging with. The 3D models are something which are really catching on in the way people can engage with it. And you'll see the points on this model. We effectively provided a bit of a quick tour around the hoard, both of the objects and telling about the context and the significance of that deposition in the Bronze Age. So just trying to convey a little message about that deposit. Now moving on to archaeological sites, this is sort of where I suppose I really started taking an interest in 3D modelling, was through trying to capture those sort of fleeting moments of an archaeological excavation. Certainly when I started working at the Ness of Brodgar in 2011, you know, the site changed on a daily basis. And I begun to take a lot more photographs and think about how I could sort of try and capture some of that in more detail. And that's when I really started trying to make 3D models of the sites. And you can see I put up a couple of images on the left of how I sort of tackle this task. It's with a camera on a pole. I've always preferred to just, you know, you could take those images with a drone or something else, but I've always liked that manual control of moving across the site with a camera and taking the photos at the points you want. My aim is obviously to try and walk in straight lines across this site, but that's always a bit of a challenge when you've got giant holes and walls in your way. But I think you'll agree that certainly across some of these areas, I've got vaguely straight lines. Obviously, what I'm aiming for is photographs that significantly overlap across the whole site to get a good representative model. And you'll see on some where we have the walls of this structure are near vertical, I've taken some oblique photos looking in to try and capture that detail as well. So really capturing these sites was, you know, again, it was a great way of sharing the process of excavating the Ness. And we could say within 24 hours of taking the photographs for a model, we could share that model with the public through the blog. And some of them were getting really, really high numbers of hits. It's that, you know, an incredible way of just being able to get straight in there and see what's been discovered and explore that sort of site for yourself. So yeah, it was that was where I sort of really started, and it got me thinking about some of the old sites that I'd worked on and whether I could create models from images I'd taken but not specifically intended for photogrammetry. So some of you may have worked with me on Pullyhour Henge with Richard Bradley up in 2009 up in Caithness. You can see it was I think it was March and April we were there, particularly good wet year from the amount of mud you can see in the image around here. But it rendered out actually quite a nice model of that excavation, which I think it gives quite a good view of that small middle to late Bronze Age henge monument. Now moving forward in time, one of the things I got quite interested in was modelling Neolithic tombs. And I know sort of Highland has a good array of Neolithic tombs. Unfortunately, I was living on Orkney at the time, so I mostly focused my attentions on Orcadian tombs. But the interesting thing about many of the Orcadian ones is that obviously they've been roofed over to create a sort of interior to the monument as well. And what really intrigued me when I first started looking at these was about creating models of both the interior and exterior. And I produced a few of those and put them out online. And after a while, Steve Farrer from Historic Environment Scotland, their interpretation team, got in touch with me, and they commissioned me to basically make models of all of the monuments in Orkney, the Neolithic tombs in Orkney, as part of their interpretation program, where they're revising old interpretation panels. Many of those in Orkney were about 20 years old, and what they really needed was visualizations, new models that could be fed in to produce illustrations for the new panels. Because you see here, they're often based on quite traditional archaeological illustrations, and they wanted a proper 3D image of many of the sites. And physically, those models were not readily available. So the idea was that I would go around the sites and produce models of the interior and exterior. And this was quite an interesting challenge. Obviously, the exterior of the mounds, much like an archaeological site, you can see the little blue rectangles where I'm walking in lines, taking photographs across the mound to get a good coverage of the surface. But obviously, with a Neolithic passage tomb, you have the challenge of going through a very narrow passage into the chamber, and then the cells at the side obviously being very small areas to work in, some no more than 1 meter high. So it was how you move from that space and actually capture all of the images you need. And the process involves, you can see in the interior, that's a much higher density of photographs than on the outside, and that's to capture that detail of that particular space. Now, it might look, that model, as if it's a really nicely brightly lit tomb, but that's actually effect of the process which I used to capture that model. I was actually often working in pitch black because I discovered that the easiest way to capture these images was to use a fixed flash on the camera, and basically when you stitch the images together, you ended up producing a model that looked like a fully lit tomb. So so this was the net result of working in the dark, was producing something that looks like a wonderful, fabulously lit monument, but it is in fact a very dark was a dark monument when I was in there. So these models, they varied in the amount of images that went into them. Sometimes 1,200. The largest had about 2,500 images in it. But that was exceptional. Many were at the smaller end of this scale. In terms of capturing the images, as I say, the reason this process, we decided to do this, was because actually the cost of producing these models is comparatively cheap. I only required half a day on site to capture the images for these for each tomb. So it was a very quick walk across the surface, backwards and forwards, and then going through the spaces. And structure from motion is all about taking the photos and moving on. But in terms of with these monuments, I was checking some of the logs, and it was roughly every 3 seconds when I was actually working through the site. So it really was a click and move, a click and move, a click and move to actually get those get the images across the site. But the results came out very well. And really here we were working to produce models that were of a quality for interpretation, not a perfect record of the monument in terms of a survey record. So there's a slight difference there in how these models were being created for. They were being created for a very specific purpose of interpretation. Now again, with these models, there was a little bit of post-processing here. I chose to actually divide the models up into different sections. So here at Blackhammer, you can see I've taken the skin of the tomb, the mound off, and then I've separated the Neolithic stonework from the modern sort of concrete structure. And the reason I did that was because I wanted to put them back together to produce images like this. So when you go on to Sketchfab, through Historic Environment Scotland's Sketchfab page, you can find this view of the tomb at Caerwyn, and it gives you a really better understanding of how the actual chamber fits within the mound. You know, just a model of a grass mound isn't that exciting, but this way you can see through it and understand how that tomb sits in the ground. But if you choose to go and stand within the monument, you get that view on the left-hand side of a sort of solid structure, as it would be inside. And if you are in there in virtual reality, it is, you know, it's very much like the experience of being within the tomb, although, as I say, it's better lit than the original. This one obviously has no lighting in it at all, so it is pitch black. I'll just briefly mention the home of Papa Westry South, because it's one of the more remote tombs. It's one of the most remote properties in care that Historic Environment Scotland manage. Certainly from mainland, you need 3 ferries or a couple of flights and a ferry to get to this island on the home of Papa Westry, uninhabited island. And you know, the tomb there is one of the most remarkable you might ever get to, and it's a very unusual tomb. Lots of these very small side cells, but what's really striking about it is much of the rock art. And so while we were there, we took the opportunity of making a more detailed record of some of the carvings in this tomb, typified by these eyebrow motifs you get across the lintel. And these were sort of first recorded by George Petrie back in the 19th century, but many of them were not closely located anymore. So through photogrammetry, we made a very good record of actually what survives, and you can see it differs somewhat from what was recorded in the 19th century. But you know, you can find details like this additional carving here, probably initials, an E or a B or a D carved over the surface of it. At what point, we don't know. And I'll just mention Antonia Thomas has done a complete survey of the rock art in this tomb, complete reassessment of it. And actually, there are a few new carvings of eyebrows that have been located, and you know, we've used some of the 3D modelling to sort of provide imagery of that as well. So that was a good little extra to have a look at some of the rock art that was in that location. Now, as I said, the main purpose of these models was to inform new interpretation panels. And so here's an example of one of the final images produced by Bob Marshall. Then all now installed across Orkney, all the new panels. This view of Coyness, you see, has taken that original model and reworked it into something that gives it more depth in terms of a cutaway section that's more easily understood than, say, that 3D model that is a quite odd view because you're seeing the stonework from the inside. So this has made it more solid and more easy to understand, but it's a step away from using these 19th century sort of plans and sections, slightly different perspective. Now, the models I've shown, those ones obviously incorporating an awful lot of images, and although I said they were relatively expedient, they still need half a day on site. That's not true of every model I've always made. This one, Cairn Laith near Golspie, one of my favourite spots to stop off when I'm driving backwards and forwards from Orkney. And this model was actually made in 20 minutes, sort of stop off, just a quick few hundred photos around the monument. It's not the best texture on the grass, but it shows it doesn't necessarily take that much to actually create a reasonable 3D model of a site with comparatively little time and comparatively few images. Now, I do want to mention as well one other person who you will find an awful lot of work, photogrammetry work on Sketchfab, and that's Hamish Fenton. And Hamish has sort of travelled very extensively across the Highlands. I think he's been out to Hebrides and Orkney and Shetland, and he loves making 3D models of many of the sort of cultural heritage sites in the region. They're often made with kite aerial photography. So you get that more larger perspective of the landscape. And so there's some absolutely incredible models he has produced. I particularly like this one of Kirkstoff, Brock in Kais. You see the, you can really appreciate the Brock with its surrounding extramural settlement, which you can't appreciate in any way from the ground because of the undergrowth. So I think, have a look at these. There's a vast number of these models online, and many of them haven't received the views which they probably should have. Now, I'm just briefly going to talk about what I would like to see happening in the future, because we often see we go and visit the sites to actually get an understanding of the architecture, to get a feeling of the actual monuments themselves. And then we visit museums and we look at the artefacts and we get told a story about the artefacts. And very much National Museum of Scotland we tell our stories with the objects. So, but there's a real opportunity here with the 3D models of sites, the 3D models of objects from the site, such as this group of objects from Skara Brae, of actually trying to bring these together and provide a new experience of these objects within the context in which they were found and used. And there's certainly, I think a real opportunity for doing this within developments in the museum, of actually presenting, certainly in virtual reality or perhaps augmented reality, a way of putting these objects and experience these objects in that space. There is it's a very different experience being able to interact with an object in that environment, in a virtual environment, than actually just seeing it in a case. So I think we can try and develop the way we use these objects in the future in the museum environment and try and incorporate them more into our displays. And that way of being able to bring the sites together into the museum with the objects, I think could be a really interesting process. Now I'm just going to do a quick plug here, because this 3D model of these skulls here was produced for Maya Hall, and there is coming up this next Saturday at 8 p.m. on Channel 4. Maya will be talking about the Bronze Age burials from Akerol and Aknavanek. So we, as part of this, produced a 3D model of one of the Neolithic skulls from East Rattacairn in Caithness, which is the sort of very long, narrow skull in the foreground, and set that against the Akerol skull, the more typically round-headed skull from Akerol. So that's coming out. It's a quick plug. It will be interesting viewing. I'm sure it was going to be a very good show about the Bronze Age in general and Beaker people. So I'm going to leave it there for now. I've got no idea actually how long I've been talking for, because I don't have a clock ticking here. But I hope I've sort of just given you an idea of some of the projects working on at the moment in the museum and some of the other sites that we've got in 3D. There's a lot on Sketchfab. Do have a look. I've put up a few of the sort of national museums, my own account there as well, and Historic Environment Scotland. There's new stuff appearing all the time, and as I say, if you want to explore it in virtual reality and augmented reality, it is a fantastic time to do that. It's never been more important to actually be able to access these sites remotely, and you can do it now. So that's fabulous. Right, I'll leave it there for now, but thank you all.
Thank you very much, Hugo. Thank you very much. That was an amazing presentation, and I don't know about others, but I'm certainly feeling inspired and motivated to get involved, and I've got a feeling I'm going to start 3D modeling anything I can get my hands on, and hopefully others. I can see that. Yes. No, I can see that it is, and I can see that how once you've started 3D modeling one site, how that very quickly moves on to another and another and another. And yeah, I mean, it's amazing to think that this type of technology was barely conceivable only a few years ago, let alone accessible to almost anyone. So things are really rapidly changing. And I think what I really love about this entire concept is that it gives people access to archaeology in a whole brand new way, has the potential to open up heritage to an entirely new audience, as well as seeing and interrogating archaeological landscapes and sites and artifacts in new ways. And I'm really taken with the idea of being able to digitally handle and manipulate artifacts that otherwise are entirely off limits, like the carved stone balls, and really just, so many different possibilities. Um, I'm going to take the opportunity at this point just to open up, go to the audience and see if there's any questions or comments, unless you've already covered everything. And let's have a look and see. Does anyone have any questions for Hugo, or is he that good? Okay. Out of interest, Hugo, how many carved stone balls actually have been found?
There are around, well, I think that there's about 520, 530.
Wow.
But there's 330 where we know their whereabouts. But then there's some historic records which they are very good descriptions of what clearly is a carved stone ball, but obviously, we don't know where that object is anymore. And so there's always a risk in terms of double counting where they've cropped up with a provenance in the 19th century, but they could be one of the unprovenance ones that crops up 100 years later. So it's somewhere probably between 350 and 500.
So do you suspect quite a few are still languishing in private collections and sat in dusty storerooms?
Oh yeah, almost certainly. Yeah, I mean, I think many of them in museums will obviously be spotted. They're quite a visual, easily identified object, but I'm sure there are many more out there. It's like in the 19th century when they first started being collected, when they were, many had obviously been on mantelpieces in farmhouses for many generations before they cropped up. That's why so many of the ones we've got have very loose provenances, because they many of them had very long histories out of the ground before they ever went into a collection.
Yeah. We have some questions appearing on the chat, but just before we get to those, I'm going to ask you one more question, if I may. And just in terms of that, we're obviously increasingly recognizing the importance of digital technologies in promoting and engaging with our heritage in all its forms. And you spoke briefly about augmented and virtual reality. And I'm really interested to hear, given where we are now, where you think these or subsequent technologies might take us in the next, 5, 10, 20 years, but also how you think that these technologies will affect how archaeology as a discipline is actually studied.
It's a real challenge, as you say. It's such a dynamic field that the technology is constantly changing. It's I find virtual reality. I find it is obviously very immersive, very engaging, but it's sometimes quite challenging. It works very well at home, but it's sometimes where I have used it in museum environments. It's a very different experience in terms of you have to think about where you're putting your bag and your coat and the space and things like that. And you just think it's not a mass audience thing, and it's also at the moment it's largely an individual thing. I think the key changes we can see is where it becomes a group experience, and you're entering that environment with other people. That's where it would become a real different experience. But yeah, the technology is rapidly changing in many ways. A lot of what we're producing or have produced here are just sort of nuts and bolts which can go feed into these projects, try and bring it together. They have so many purposes, the models, and I think that's what's really interesting, is that you can produce one model and you can use it for research, you can reuse it for public engagement, you can 3D print it for handling with children and the public, and so a single model can be used in so many different ways. And I think yes, there is not really much limit on what you can use it for at present. I think it's the cost of developing many of the technologies which is obviously holding it back often in the museum sector, I think.
3D printing isn't something I'd even thought of, but of course the opportunities there are fairly boundless, aren't they? I'm going to go to Kirsty now, who's going to, I think, try and pull some of the questions off the chat, and she'll put those to you as well.
Yeah, we've got at the moment we've got 6 questions. So if you're up for answering all 6, Hugo, we'll go through it. And maybe keep on the sort of technological aspect to start off with. 2 of the questions are: one, can you discuss some of the particulars of your camera equipment? Sort of what kind of camera do you need? And on a similar thing, what's the process after taking the photos and downloading them into the app? So you know, it's about the actual kit. What do you use?
Yeah, I do. So the actual kit I use is a sort of mid-range crop digital SLR. You can use any camera really, but you know, obviously the better your sensor, the better model you're going to ultimately come out with. So you can use a mobile phone to capture it, but they are very tiny sensors that aren't great quality. So your model won't be as good as if you use a better camera. And similarly, the processing, it's all about the pixels in an image. So the higher megapixel camera you get, or how close you are to the object, the higher the resolution that model is ultimately going to be. So so there are benefits in, you know, certain more expensive kits, but you know, most mid-range cameras work very well for the process. In terms of actually processing the models, I didn't want to talk too much about it. Obviously varies a lot between individual software, but there's so much of it is comparatively automated these days. In terms of the software, I mean, that's the thing with this technology. Once you produce one model, you learn, you know, often you'll have a few errors. You know, you can't understand what's going wrong, but once you've cracked one, it suddenly becomes clear what you have to do. And often it's about how you capture the images as well. So it's capturing that good array of images all the way around an object, making sure you have the overlap in those images. I always say that you can never have too many images, but you can always have too few. And that's certainly the problem being, actually, it's not quite true, because if you take too many, your computer might object and not want to process them if you have many thousands of images. But you know, you have the option of adding more images or taking away images. But if you only take, say, 30 or 40 images, it might just not produce a model. So in terms of producing those images, if, say, it's an archaeological site, there's nothing moving within it, you just literally put those images in, you align them, and you can automate it so it goes straight the way through aligning the photos and then processing them into a mesh and then adding a photo texture. Almost straight, very automated. In terms of artifacts, if you have, say, a background and you need to mask that out, sometimes you just have to take the backgrounds out for it to align the images. But I tend to photograph on a white background, and that often leaves nothing which can be found beyond the object in the middle of that photograph. So again, you can still just put them straight in and it will align those cameras. It's quite automated, a lot of that. So it's relatively.
So the app guides you through the process, does it?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. One of the other questions we have here, where are we? Can you discuss, oh, sorry, no, more questions have come in. Well, the first question was from Anna Welch. I may have missed it, but what stone are the carved balls made of, and is it local to where they've been found? So
that's a very good question. It's something we need to do a lot more work on, actually. But certainly there's a massive range of carved stone balls. That some are made in sandstone, some are made in granite, some are various different metamorphic rocks. There is a massive variety of the actual rock types they've used. They're often not exciting rocks, if you know what I mean. It's not like the late Neolithic mace heads where they're picking the really fancy, highly patterned stones. They're often a bit dull. And certainly some of them, there are hints that things like the Towie ball might have been blackened up so that they are just very plain looking sort of stones. But yeah, there's a massive variety. Where the rocks come from, there are certainly granite ones from Aberdeen where there is granite. There's certainly some of the Orkney ones are made from trap rock in Orkney, and in terms of the camptonite from the dikes in West Mainland. There's one from the Hebrides that is made of a sort of Lewisian gneiss type rock. So there are certainly they're not all being manufactured in one place and then distributed out. They are being manufactured at different sites as well.
Okay,
but yeah,
thank you.
We need a geologist to come and look at them all, really.
Have you not got one in the museum?
Yeah, we do. They're just across the corridor. But yeah, I do try and convince them to come in and look at 200 objects, but they.
Yeah. Okay. Right, we've got another question here from Roberta Bailey. How widespread are the carved stone balls? What's their sort of distribution then?
As I say, it's very limited. So it's well, you think Aberdeenshire is not a very small area, but the fact they drop off very rapidly outside that distribution of Aberdeenshire. So it goes from being, hundreds in Aberdeenshire to tens, say, from Perthshire to the borders. It's a few, and then England. I say there's 2 in the whole of England. So there is a very distinct area, but that sort of cluster up the northeast coast and to Orkney, there is a more distinct cluster. I think there are a dozen from Orkney, so it's not a huge number compared to Aberdeenshire, but there's still a good number up there. But that's obviously a bias of field work as well. So there's probably an equal distribution through Sutherland and Caithness as well, and certainly there have been many found there in the past as well. It's just we're not seeing it through land use and whatever else.
It's interesting. I mean, they're so portable, aren't they? They obviously didn't stray far from where they were used, though. I mean, nobody could have nicked one and went away south or anything. But you think that might be tempting, but obviously they had that much respect that no one was going to run away with them. I'm tempted myself, I have to say.
They are very enigmatic, and they're all slightly different, and that's what I find really exciting about sharing these models is that we have 10 on display at the museum. Quite a few museums have a few on display, but you only ever see a few at a time. You don't get a chance to see a massive proportion of the overall total in one place, which you can in virtual reality. I've recently modelled those from Perth Museum as well, so they're all online too, and you begin to get to see this big collection of them. And you realise that some of the photos, if you Google carved stone balls, you get the same black and white photo from the 1980s of a very neat line of 5 carved stone balls. They're actually from the Ashmolean, those ones, and they sort of show very regular designs, and that's often, that's really helped reinforce this idea that they are all exceptionally geometric objects, and that's because that's their collection. They have a selection of the most regular forms, whereas when you go through our collection, we've got all sorts of different shapes and variations. But again, we put the Towie ball most prominently on display, and that's probably one of the most atypical of the lot.
Just staying on the carved stone ball theme, another follow-up question from Norman Newton. He's asking, have you looked in the nooks and crannies of carved stone balls for traces of colouring or paint?
I suspect if we looked, there is a challenge, is that certainly, say, for the Towie ball, there's a lovely photograph from the 1950s of where someone's rubbed chalk over the surface to emphasise the designs. So, when I did look at it recently, there is still a little bit of that chalk in one of the grooves. So the thing is, we can't always be guaranteed that what's on the surface of these objects is necessarily of great antiquity. But there are some traces of residue on some. It's just we don't know how old it is. And so I think there is potential that some of them have been coloured. As I say, some of the darker stones are actually, when we have had a geologist look at them, they're actually quite light coloured rocks. So they have been stained, but it's whether that is because they've been in the ground for so long or because it was a deliberate process. So that is something that still needs to be looked at. There's a lot of research that still needs to be done on these.
I've got another question, 2 more questions to go. This one is from Alan Gillies. I don't know if I fully understand it. So Alan, if you're still there, please pop in if I've got it wrong. Just join the conversation. So the question, as I read it, is there any potential to combine AI with 3D models? For example, I could imagine AI analysing large amounts of 3D data and spotting patterns like random pot shares that fit together, patterns that repeat in different carved balls, possible regional patterns, like a sort of big data approach?
I suspect there is, yes. Yeah. Certainly there has been some work done on trying to automate the refitting of shirts using AI. Yeah, that's perfectly viable. I think again, we're sort of at the first stage. We're creating this data and finding uses for it. But yeah, I think it would be an interesting application to see how AI might try and group carved stone balls from the form alone. Because at the moment we have classifications which really don't work because it's based on counting knobs on the surface, and as we're sort of emphasizing, or I was saying, that they are changing form during their life. We can see that they are developing. So the idea that some of Dorothy Marshall's categories of a type 4 with 6 knobs and a type 5 with sort of 7 knobs is significant. It doesn't really work. So yeah, there is potential there, and I think that would be an interesting thing. Certainly, the patterns of tooling and the sequences of working on these stones is interesting. That's something I'm constantly working on trying to develop that. There is a big project in that in terms of looking at how the sequences of how these were worked and changed over time.
That's great.
Yes, if it could be automated, that would be great.
Yeah.
Okay, we have time for one last question, Hugo, and this is from Grace Warmer-White, formerly of this parish, but not for much longer. Regarding the modelling of sites, with the current situation, Ochi says, obviously a lot of sites have been closed in Scotland and are only slowly reopening now. Do you think modelling of sites is going to become a more common alternative and possibly actually lead to access to physical sites reducing in the future?
It's an interesting one. I personally think that creating models doesn't you're creating an alternative way of looking at it. You're not getting rid of the original, so it's not replacing it. And I think often, it's sort of the sort of really iconic sites that people know about because they can find them online are the sites people go to. So in some ways, having more information, more access to these sites before people choose where they're going to go actually might increase traffic to them rather than decrease it. It shows you what you're going to get, but it doesn't necessarily give you the real experience of being in that tomb. You can look at it, but you don't actually get the experience of being there. So I think in that way, it's in terms of public access, I think it could encourage people to go to a lot of these sites, particularly those off the beaten track, where if you do have to go really out of your way to get to that site, it's a long walk, it's a difficult route, then it may in fact increase the traffic to those sites. Certainly when we were putting out all the 3D models of the Nessa Brodka, they didn't have an adverse effect on the number of people who were actually coming to the site. It's sort of more, it was another thing that showed that how dramatic that site was and encouraged people to actually visit them for themselves.
Certainly the Papa Westray model there was incredible, and I'm like wanting to run there right now. I don't know. I mean, it was really nice, and the illustration as well. The way that it formed the basis of that sort of cut through illustration was fantastic as well. So I can see certainly, yeah, I agree that there's room for both for sure.
Historic Environment Scotland are working with the local communities in Orkney to actually put some of those models in the visitor centres. So, say Holme of Papa Westray is inaccessible when the wind's up and the ships and the boat's not running, but there is a visitor centre on Papa Westray that can host the 3D model. So you might have an alternative to access it if you get to the island but can't get actually across to the tomb. So there, there are lots of alternative ways that these models can be used as well in different visitor centres too.
I've just noticed there is actually another question in here, Hugo, which we can squeeze in. So it's Suzanne, and she's asking, do you recommend any specific software for processing the photos?
I sort of I use what I like, as it were. So I tend to use Agisoft PhotoScan, and that's because I have that software. There are plenty of other programs which work equally as well, equally as viable to use, and there's obviously other methods of obtaining 3D models as well. It's a matter of preference, really. I personally quite like the sort of visual interface on Agisoft. It's not, it makes it look less techy, as it were, makes it more user friendly. But it's a matter of choice, really. The one really good thing is that there's so many good forums online to actually talk you through the process of doing it, and so many places, people that will answer questions, as invariably you do hit when you're using any new technology, challenges. But there are so many people out there willing to help and give advice and tutorials on YouTube and other things. There's so much information that you can find. It's really, it's quite a helpful community.
Great. Well, what a great place to stop. And to say thank you, Hugo, for your fascinating, interesting and engaging presentation. And I'm sure everyone here enjoyed it as much as we did. And thank you to you all as well for coming and spending your evening with us and asking such an amazing range of excellent questions. So it's very, very much appreciated.